Welcome to Charity Village Connects. I'd like to acknowledge that I work and live on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat in Toronto. And today, joining me is Dr. Wendy Sukier. Wendy is the founder of the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University and academic director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, as well as research lead of the Future Skills Center. A best-selling author, Wendy's work in diversity has been recognized with many awards, including the Harry Jerome Diversity Award, the Bob Marley Award, and the Canada-Pakistan Business Council's Female Professional of the Year Award, among many other honors. Welcome, Wendy. We're so pleased to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Mary.
I'd really like to start just by, if you could tell our listeners what the Diversity Institute does and the kind of work that you do.
Sure. Well, the Diversity Institute is in the Ted Rogers School of Management, so that our work, while grounded in a commitment to social justice, really draws on the business case for diversity. How does addressing diversity and inclusion help organizations become more effective? And we have about 120 researchers now in the Diversity Institute and another 100 or so spread across the country and around the world. And we partner with about 200 organizations on a number of different projects. So we're the research lead for the Future Skills Center, really focused on how to address skills gaps and make sure that employers are not looking for talent in all the wrong places. We lead the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, which is really trying to strengthen the infrastructure to support diverse women entrepreneurs. We have just been awarded some work to support the federal government's 50/30 challenge, which is focused on increasing diversity on boards and in senior leadership roles. And of course, you have to start upstream if you want to see Black leaders in the next few years. But we have a lot of other work that deals with specific populations, specific projects, or even work with organizations to help them develop their diversity and inclusion strategies.
That's a huge portfolio and amazing projects. And I really want to get to hear about your 50/30 project. But I wanted to touch on a few things that have been going on in the not-for-profit sector and some of the things that we've seen in the media, and ask you whether this so-called Great Resignation, in your perspective, is actually happening in Canada. And if so, how DEI initiatives, or the lack of them in organizations making up the nonprofit sector, it might be contributing to burnout, turnover, or a dissatisfaction with working in those workplaces that may be at least non-inclusive and certainly maybe even toxic.
Yeah, I think the nonprofit sector is no different than other sectors. I do think that the so-called Great Resignation is less obvious, at least now in Canada, than in the United States. And some of that has to do, I think, with the structure of our economy, perhaps, as well as the strength of our social programs. But as well, I think we heard all through the pandemic, particularly for women, the crushing burden of unpaid work and childcare and homeschooling and so on. And there is evidence that as many as 30% of women contemplated leaving the workforce. But the latest data doesn't actually suggest that has happened. In fact, early in the pandemic, it was clear that women were losing their jobs at a much higher rate than others. And at this particular point in time, it looks like that gap has narrowed. Although some have asked the question, what kinds of jobs are women in? And, I certainly know from my own circle of friends that many have transitioned, many have scaled back. Some have shifted, for example, from working for someone else to working for themselves. And so I'm sure we see very much the same thing in the nonprofit sector, where someone may have been a full-time graphic designer working at a big NGO or a full-time fundraiser working round the clock, and they may have decided to work for themselves instead. But one of the things that without question we are seeing is a lethal competition for talent now. And so despite all of the concerns about job loss, and you know, before the pandemic, everyone worried about automation eating our jobs. Right now, it is really a battle for talent. I mean, even among my own staff, on a daily basis, people are being poached by other organizations. We see, and everyone I talk to is feeling the same way. So, you know, demographics are catching up with us. You know, the boomers like me are dying or retiring. I want to do the latter before I do the first, but it's not clear that will happen. And so I think there is a real intensified competition for talent, especially people who are experienced, but it's not clear that it's, you know, a symptom of massive numbers of people throwing up their hands and saying, I won't work anymore.
Yes, I mean, we've certainly seen reports like, for example, when I just interviewed Jim Moss from the YMCA and their WorkWell report, that community report that talked about how people were contemplating leaving, and if they hadn't left because of burnout and those sorts of issues. But you're quite right. It almost offers an opportunity to retain people if you're aware that this is the feeling among many people working in the nonprofit sector. And as well, if there's issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, there's still an opportunity to potentially address problems in there that might be creating toxic workplaces that would influence somebody to decide to leave. Have you had any?
Yeah, I think you're right on. And I know that, you know, in my own case, I've had a couple of people signal that they couldn't do the juggling anymore. You know, one of my staff had 4 children under the age of 10. And the nice thing about working at a university and in the nonprofit sector, for me anyways, is that we have flexibility, so that we're able to say, take a couple of weeks off and you know, or cut back to 3 days a week or work flexible hours. So I think the university in general, and certainly in my unit in particular, we're trying really hard to be accommodating where it's obvious that people just need more flexibility in how they're working. I do think that the other thing that's massive and really under-considered is the explosion in needs for mental health supports, like the extent, and this is particularly true of women, and we know that women dominate at least the lower levels of the nonprofit sector, though not necessarily the top levels. We know that women have seen a much greater deterioration in their mental health. And in fact, if you break it down by different ethnic groups, you'll see big differences too. People of Chinese origins are the ones that currently have the lowest level of mental health, according to our Environics survey, and the biggest decline. And we can all imagine that probably has a lot to do with the rise in anti-Asian racism. We've heard that there are some people who don't want to go back to traditional workplaces. And in fact, I've seen some evidence that as companies are calling their employees back, some people are saying, I think I like working at home. I'm going to look for an option that suits my interests and my lifestyle. So definitely we've seen evidence of that. And in fact, a recent report suggested that women were less likely to want to return to the workplace because in spite of the burden, it gives them more flexibility. And the other group that doesn't want to return to the workplace, racialized people, because of the constant microaggressions. So it looks like white men will be returning to the workplace in larger numbers. than others. I think that a lot of organizations, and I was on the board of, for example, Women's College Hospital, sorry. They really, especially because they have frontline healthcare workers, invested heavily in trying to come up with new solutions to help staff overcome the risks of burnout and so on. And I think a lot of progressive employers are investing far more heavily in, COVID weeks and more mental health supports and more attention on how people are feeling, not just what they're doing. So there are a combination of things going on. My guess, I could be wrong, but my guess is that, often in the not-for-profit sector, the margins are slim. The pressure, for example, on the fundraisers is probably greater than it's ever been. We know of some organizations that have had to close their doors because they can't manage the transition, just as we've seen lots of small, medium enterprises fold. So I think, in some parts of the nonprofit sector, there's probably much more stress and pressure than there is, say, in a university or a hospital, where we have the benefit of being large institutions.
I'd like to go back and dig a little deeper on your observation about racialized individuals who, are not wanting to go back into the workplace because, in fact, they've been able to avoid the microaggressions that have been making their workplaces toxic for them. Could you give us more insight into that, and how that could be playing out in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, it's an issue that we've known is a problem for a long time. The research has been mounting that microaggressions are almost, as bad as the experience of overt racism, because often the people who are subjected to them are not sure if it's them, it's in their imagination. When people treat you in a certain way, it's hard to tell if you're just being sensitive or what the intention is of some of the comments and so on. So we've known for a long time that creates stress. It creates, mental health impacts, but also physical health impacts. And it may be that for some people, not having to go into that environment day in, day out has actually been a relief. And it's interesting because when we look, this could be an indicator, I don't know, but when we look at the mental health of people who identify as Black, it's the highest among different segments of the population. And you can read that in different ways. But one of the ways that we might read it is that they are not experiencing some of the same issues that they did previously. So it's hard to tell. But for sure, we've seen that COVID has hit racialized people harder. They're more vulnerable to infection because they're more likely to be in the front lines and so on. They're less likely to have the resources, a big house, a high-speed internet, lots of devices and so on to be able to adapt to the environment. So there's really good evidence that racialized people in general have been hit harder by COVID. But some of the research that's coming out now is sort of interesting because it does suggest that this environment has been a bit of an equalizer. That all of the research suggests that women and racialized people and Indigenous people and persons with disabilities and so on are often disadvantaged in the workplace because of the power and pervasiveness of social networks and favoritism and homophilia, where people who are the same hang out together, go for coffee together, and so on. And maybe in this new virtual environment, it's less about those informal, unspoken rules and more about doing the work I don't know. It's hard to say.
That is really fascinating. And, certainly one that makes a lot of sense when you connect the dots about a lot of the change that this remote work has actually had on the workplace and the workers themselves. Super fascinating. I've actually heard anecdotes from people who work with nonprofits, leaders or leadership, and support and recruitment, that in many instances there's been a high turnover of leaders during COVID saying, I'm out of here, taking early retirement, deciding to not resign so much as to accelerate their retirement after being there for many, many, potentially decades. And that some of the reasons why they're struggling is the expectation that they really deal with inequitable and toxic workplaces because they haven't addressed diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, and haven't been able to build a culture that supports everyone to come to work as their true selves and is inclusive. And that they realize the kind of work that it's going to take, and they just haven't got it in them to deliver. Have you come across anything like that?
I haven't heard that, but it's very interesting. I mean, one of the things that I do think is true, and it may be, if you imagine that in the nonprofit sector, people tend to be more progressive and more inclusive in general, simply because of the sector they're in. One might also think that the human costs of COVID and the burden that's posing for their employees, their clients, the people that they serve, like, it's pretty grim. And then on the other hand, the decline in access to fundraising and so on. I can't imagine a more stressful time for anyone in a nonprofit leadership role, like stuck between massive increase in demand that you can't possibly meet, massive decline in resources, staff who perhaps previously were, engaged and motivated, or at least seem to be, who are on the verge of collapse. You put those three things together, and I think that creates a pretty challenging environment. And then, as you said, if you layer on top of them these added expectations to do things differently, I can see that it's not a happy time. When I look at leaders in healthcare institutions or universities, which are the ones I'm most familiar with, or some of the bigger agencies providing services to people without homes, to people without food, to people who are unemployed, I would say it's a pretty stressful environment. On the other hand, if you're running a professional nonprofit, a professional association, I'm not sure it's quite the same.
Well, I want to step back a little bit and take a more macro look, and really focus on the nonprofit sector, particularly during this time, and ask you about whether you see any key areas or trends related to DEI that organizations should be aware of right now, that are, the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the pandemic. What kind of trends did that create in the nonprofit sector that leaders need to know about?
Yeah, I think, I've been working on issues related to gender and diversity for probably 30 years. And I would say more has changed in the last 2 than in the previous 28. So there's no question that the murder of George Floyd really heightened our attention on issues facing people who are Black as distinct from other racialized people. The terrorist attack in London, Ontario on a family walking down the street, I think heightened our awareness of the issues of Islamophobia. The discovery of the unmarked graves of Indigenous children in Kamloops, and then finding it was a problem across the country. For people even like me who are supposed to be aware of some of these issues, that was a huge wake-up call. And, just to digress, I remember thinking about sending out some kind of statement, and I wasn't sure what it should say. And I wrote something that was, I'm shocked and appalled. I'm sure all of you are shocked and appalled as I was. And I sent it to my Indigenous employees, and they looked at me and said, "Why were you shocked? Why were you appalled? We've known this for generations," and it's true. It was in the Truth and Reconciliation report. It was alluded to in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women reports. I sort of knew about it, but I didn't really know about it. So I think there's also been a bit of a phenomena during this time where things that we kind of were aware of have really become sort of visceral realities for us. And that's created way more attention, focus, and certainly aspiration around diversity and inclusion. But moving from that to action is an entirely different matter. And I think that, what I would observe is that good intentions aren't good enough anymore. And you see a lot of people starting to get called out for performative EDI activities. Like, you have to, many, we've done work with large charities that say, oh, there are people who are racialized, who have money. We should adjust our philanthropic strategies so that we can reach into their pockets. But if you create a strategy to position yourself to fundraise with racialized communities, and your entire staff are white, or you don't have programs that address the specific needs of, newcomers, racialized people, and so on, or your website is all nice little white children, you've really got a problem. And I think increasingly people in the community are paying attention to whether or not organizations are walking the talk. And so, you have to be a bit more thoughtful about signing up for this proclamation or, flying a rainbow flag if you're not going to then follow through with a very deliberate strategy. So I think, I would say that accountability and the expectations have increased, but so has the accountability. And you can't get away with the same kind of, general statements about diversity as our strength. People are looking for action. I think the other thing for me that's, of course, front and center is this added attention to leadership and organizations really starting to apply a genuine gender and diversity lens to procurement. And really, and I remember Legal Leaders for Diversity a few years ago. One of my colleagues picked up a magazine, and it was like 5 white men that were, top lawyer or something. And she went as if I would do business with them and put it down. And so we did see in some sectors them starting to really push for a diversity and inclusion lens on procurement, but that's much broader now. And while a lot of charities aren't selling goods, they're selling value. And so, we've been asked in some of the diversity and inclusion work we've been doing for large corporations to do an EDI assessment of their CSR. Who are they giving money to? If they say they're committed to diversity and inclusion, is that driving their philanthropic activities? Well, if charities understand that donors are starting to use this as a lens, I think that becomes very important in terms of heightening the strategic attention on it. And then the other thing is, of course, what you mentioned, which is talent. We've gone from a situation where we had lots of people looking for jobs to a situation where we have lots of jobs looking for people. And that's going to hit nonprofits and charities harder than other sectors because they don't pay as well. So, and because increasingly private sector companies are trying to position themselves as adding value, being committed to ESGs, social sustainable development goals, and so on. So those choices you used to have about, oh, I'll go to a nonprofit and do good, and I'll go to the private sector and get rich, those dichotomies are starting to blur as more corporates are embracing social purposes as well.
I think it's so interesting that you're calling out this idea of walking your talk and not giving just lip service, and actually having it throughout the entire organization be demonstrably so, is so critical. It's like, you know, the glass door for you know, your culture. You know, the platform glass door, where employees would out organizations that didn't live up to what they were promising people in their recruitment messaging. It's such a challenge for organizations, especially smaller ones, to suddenly, with this heightened awareness and what you've described as, you know, rational, important, strategic reasons to get on this DEI journey. How do they get started? Like, what advice do you have to give to an organization who's just starting out?
Yeah, I think your point is really important, to differentiate between large organizations, which have, you know, well-established HR machines and so on, and often a lot more capacity. But if you're thinking about smaller organizations, often the same person who's doing their HR and their board governance is taking out the trash and, you know, fixing the computers. So often in smaller organizations, you don't have that, you know, dedicated HR support, and very often you don't have a dedicated EDI person. So, you know, to me, you look at the simplest way to explain what we would do is look at your strategy. What are the elements of your strategy? And then ask yourself, you know, if fundraising is a big piece of our strategy, how does that change if we apply a diversity and inclusion lens? If talent is attracting and retaining talent is a big part of our strategy, what happens if we apply a diversity and inclusion lens? And, you know, if marketing and communications is part of your strategy, what happens if we apply a diversity and inclusion lens? And that can be driven very much by the community that you're serving. If you're in Toronto, more than half the population's racialized and born outside of the country. And another quarter are people like me, who are the children of immigrants and refugees. So really, you've only a quarter of the population is white and born in Canada for 2 generations. So when you start thinking about that, you know, most good nonprofits drive their strategy based on the people that they're serving and the people that are supporting them. And so a lot of it is really common sense. Looking at your board, who's on your board. And some people will say, oh, well, you know, we don't have room and, you know, we don't have term limits. A really easy strategy is make your board bigger. Like, if you don't want to move people out to make space for new people, you can do that. Setting up committees, building closer relationships with some of the community organizations that represent the groups that you have to better understand. You know, looking at your policies, looking at your statements. Does your mission address diversity and inclusion? Do you have a statement around diversity and inclusion? Do you communicate that through your organization? Looking at how you recruit, where you recruit. What are your assumptions about the kinds of experiences that people need to have in order to work at your organization? So it's, there's no shortcuts. I mean, there are some organizations that will say, we'll ask you 3 questions and we will give you your score. And then you're done, your EDI strategy. It's, to me, the most effective way to manage this is you just think about it as part of your strategy. And there are lots of tools and supports. I mean, I mentioned at the outset the 50-30 challenge, which is focused on achieving gender parity, which is the 50%, and increased diversity, which is the 30%, on boards and in leadership roles across sectors. We're in the process of developing toolkits. So, check boxes. This is how you do your EDI strategy. Oh, you need a policy on harassment in respectful workplaces. Here's an example. Oh, you need a skills matrix for your board that includes diversity and inclusion. Here's one. So to us, it's just a process of systematically going through what you're doing, and pick the low-hanging fruit, pick the things that are easiest to address, and open the door for conversations. Because one of the challenges, and I would say less in Toronto, but in some of the smaller communities that are more homogeneous, it's a problem where you don't know what you don't know, because the people in the organization all look like you and me. So it's at a very different starting point than most of the organizations in Toronto, where you couldn't function by hiring from 1/4 of the population. But a good way to get started is you engage with the local community organizations. If you're in Winnipeg, the issues around Indigenous peoples are far more acute and front of mind than perhaps the issues around Black Canadians, although I'm sure it's an issue in Winnipeg. If you're in St. John's, Newfoundland, the percentage of the population that is racialized is going to be a lot smaller, but there's a huge push in the Maritimes to try to get newcomers to come and stay. So a lot of it is context-based. If you're a small organization, understanding the diversity of your community and how to engage with people who aren't just like you is really the first step.
Well, I'd like to go back to what you were talking about, of there not being the kind of diversity that was needed at the leadership level in the nonprofit sector. And we know that a recent StatsCan survey about the governance and the diversity in governance in the charitable and nonprofit sector really sort of shone the light on what many have called an open secret. That's that the sector is not diverse at the governance level. Could you give us your sort of highlights of the StatsCan survey and what you thought were really important of that report, what it disclosed, or was it just the fact that finally somebody disclosed it?
Well, I think that was certainly important. But what was interesting is we always think about the nonprofit sector as being dominated by women. And what's interesting is women are still not at the top to the same relative to the percentage of people in the workforce. The dramatic underrepresentation of racialized people and other diverse groups, I think, didn't come as a shock to anybody. But I do think that it's a function of historic practice, the way in which people were identified for boards. I remember, I may have mentioned this another time we were having a conversation, but I remember being on a board and talking about the need to increase diversity. And one of the board members said, and meant no harm, unintentional, but said, but I'm not a racist, but we need people with connections and money. And it was in Toronto, where more than half the population is racialized. Do we really think that racialized people don't have money or connections? But I think historically there has been, especially larger charities, there's been a real preoccupation with trying to get, the Bay Street folks and the billionaires and, the people who are going to put their name on your buildings and so on. And given that those elites, at least the ones you know about, tend to be from the same socioeconomic and ethnic background, that has, I think, created real distortions. But we've seen a lot of change, even though the numbers are still bad. If you think about what it was like 5 years ago, we've actually made a ton of progress. So, it's not moving fast enough from my perspective, but it's moving faster. And as we see, because I do think that often nonprofits are driven by their fundraising imperatives, but as we see more and more big philanthropy changing shape, that's also, I think, helping to change people's views. But fundamentally, it's not just about who's on your board; it's about who's in the organization and also who you're serving. And when you mention toxicity. Some of the studies that have come out on the experiences, particularly of women who are in the philanthropic role, and the extent, even today, the extent of sexual harassment and abuse that a lot of women in fundraising, and they tend to be the most dominant group in fundraising experience. We still have a lot to do on gender, in my view, in order to create more inclusive workplaces.
I agree with you, and I think as well, when we're talking about underrepresented groups, I think frequently these days, I think that we forget that underrepresented groups include people with varying abilities and disabilities that don't seem to have that same oxygen given to the issues around their workplaces and, hiring practices that would include them as well.
Absolutely. And, the most horrifying stat that I quote all the time is the fact that university graduates with a severe disability have worse employment outcomes than high school dropouts without a disability. In what universe does that make sense? What's also interesting, though, is with COVID, like one of the biggest requests for accommodation made by a lot of persons with disabilities is around flexibility in the workplace, flexibility in terms of hours, workplace, and so on. So while there's no doubt that some people with disabilities were really disadvantaged with I remember someone in the government who said, he no longer had access to any of the tools that he needed in his home because all the accommodations were designed around his workplace. But for every case like that, we also see cases where people have been able to work more easily and frankly without feeling discriminated against, in part because of the distributed work environment. So, it's interesting. I have a friend who's deaf who lip reads. She doesn't use ASL, and of course Zoom with the annotation is a gift from God because one of the biggest, she was always invited to join boards and be on committees and so on. And she would be absolutely exhausted by trying to watch everything that was going on and having to, gently remind people to look directly at her. I even find if we're out for dinner, I'll be eating or something and she can't interpret what I'm saying. And so I think that we have seen cases where that makes a big difference for persons with disabilities.
Wendy, could you please tell us about the 50/30 project, how nonprofit sector organizations can get involved and what it is that you're offering to the sector among other organizations?
Thanks so much for the question. Well, the 50/30 Challenge was actually created by ISED, the Innovation, Science, Economic Development Department in the federal government. It's a voluntary code, which means, it's not like the employment equity legislation where there are consequences associated with it. But basically, organizations are invited to sign up for this voluntary code that indicates that they aspire to gender parity and increased diversity on their board and senior leadership roles. And when we're talking about gender parity, we're talking about women and non-binary people. When we're talking about diversity, we're talking about racialized people, including Black people, Indigenous people, as well as persons with disabilities and those who are 2S LGBTQ+, or a combination. So think of it, if your board has 10 people, half of them are women, and 3 of the women are racialized, have a disability, or are Indigenous, you hit 50/30. But they're encouraging organizations to sign up who maybe aren't at the target, but are willing to say that by 2030, they will be 50/30. And so far there are over 1,500, and it's large corporations, small corporations, nonprofits, hospitals, universities, really a very broad spectrum. But basically what the groups that are working together will provide is all the help that you need in order to implement a diversity and inclusion strategy to support your aspirations. So I mentioned the government has funded a number of organizations to develop tools, to offer training and support to organizations that want to move forward. So I think it's a first in world effort. And what I like about it is so many initiatives focus on one group. The 30% Club focused on gender, Black North focuses on people who are Black, whereas 50/30 really allows you to put together a diversity and inclusion strategy that really fits with the environment that you're currently in. So if you're in Manitoba, maybe your 30% is going to be heavily weighted towards Indigenous peoples, whereas if you're in Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal, maybe it's going to be a higher percentage of racialized people. So it gives you flexibility, but also I think is quite a stretch goal. And we're really excited to be part of it. And we've seen lots of momentum. The other thing that I will mention, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is I believe increasingly organizations are going to be asked to account for their diversity and inclusion strategies when they're applying for funding. And I have seen a sea change. For example, in grants we've been applying for, RFPs we've been responding to, where organizations are actually asking questions around your diversity and inclusion policies, practices, and your numbers. And this, to me, gives you a tool to actually get prepped so that you can position yourself as a leader in this field. And, I'm a big believer in the business case. I would think it will help your organizational effectiveness, but I think it will also help you attract more funding and better serve your clients.
Well, I think it's very interesting. You're talking about the program being as flexible as it is. And I hadn't actually appreciated that, but you're absolutely right. It would look quite different and still be achievable in different parts of this country, which, as we know, are so different than each other in terms of the makeup of our population and the nature of our communities. I wanted to just give you an opportunity to talk about the kind of resources that you're going to also be offering as part of the rollout of the work that you're doing involved in the project. Can you talk about the kind of resources that are going to be available?
Sure. So KPMG won a bid to create a toolkit, which will help organizations get their strategies in place. Other groups that are working with the ecosystem will be providing training, as I said. We ourselves have a diversity assessment tool that helps people walk through the process, and we have examples of best practices. So you want to improve your governance, you want to focus on governance first. Here is an example of good practice. Here are some policies. Here are some strategies. And by the way, we're also creating a database of 4,000 women, racialized, and other diverse leaders from our work on diversity leads from across the country that will help people who say, you know, I like women, but there are none. Because we do hear that a lot when people are trying to recruit. They say, you know, of course we would be open to all of these different groups, but we don't know where to find them. And that's legitimate because often organizations have completely relied on social networks that they've had for decades. And so figuring out how to get out of their comfort zone and start to interact with people who are different than them is challenging. And so we want to make this as painless as possible because that's the only way to drive change.
Well, I think it's a wonderful project, and I really look forward to seeing some of your webinars that you're doing on Charity Village to bring information about this project to the nonprofit sector. So I know that you're pressed for time, so I really want to thank you for your insights and advice around these important issues. It's really helpful for the sector leaders and organizations to navigate this massive change and doing what they ought to be doing and embracing DEI as part of their whole organizational sort of makeup. So thank you for joining us.
It was really a lot of fun talking to you, Mary. So thank you.